Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is Sakshi Malik, and I welcome you all for today's lecture, which is a part of the ongoing Inspiration Lecture series at the Center of Research in Emerging Economies at Jindal Global Business School, OP Jindal Global University. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing you all to our speaker, Professor Devin Shanthikumar. Professor Devin is an associate professor at the UCI Paul Mirad School of Business and is the head of the accounting area. She teaches undergraduate, MBA, and executive level courses in managerial accounting and conducts research focusing on financial market participants. Professor Devin's research focuses on the investing decisions of individual investors and the impact that these investors have on the market, as well as on the role of the financial intermediaries and information sources. Her research has been published in top journals, including the Accounting Review, the Journal of Financial Economics, Review of Financial Studies, and Management Science. Professor Devin was named to Poet and Quant's Best 40 Under 40 Business Professors in 2019, and she has won numerous other awards. Professor Devin earned her BS in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from the University of California, Berkeley. She earned her PhD in Business Administration with a focus in finance from Stanford's Graduate School of Business. Prior to joining the Mirad School of Business, she served as a professor at Harvard Business School. Dr. Devin will be talking today on the topic, does interaction on social media drive extremeness or moderation? Before I request Dr. Shanthikumar to start the talk, here are a few basic rules which I would request everyone to follow. Please remember to keep your microphone muted and webcams turned off all the time during the lecture. Second, after the lecture, Dr. Devin will take questions. During the talk, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box and Dr. Devin will address them in the end. Dr. Devin, thank you so much for accepting our invite. We all are eager to hear you. The stage is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the great introduction, Sakshi. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and feedback on this paper that I'm about to present. I'm very excited to present this work. My co-authors, Shijia and Annie, are on this talk as well, so they can help me answer questions as we go. But as you can see just from the title itself, I'm excited about this topic because it is so timely and topical. Does interaction on social media drive extremeness or moderation? Now, I have several slides to discuss the motivation for this paper, but at a high level, I think we can all understand that the interaction on social media and the effect that that has on polarization in society is fundamentally important right now. Now, drawing that to the finance and accounting setting, we address a more specific question, but I think this applies really to the bigger picture idea of what is the impact and importance of social media on our society. All right, now let me get into those slides I just mentioned about the specific motivation. So why social media? I'm putting up here a really hot example, and this is not exactly what we look at, but this was in the news so much in January and February that I couldn't resist including it. There was the huge Gamestop rally that happened because of Reddit users. And so what we had here with Gamestop was, so if you're not familiar with GameStop, and honestly, I had seen it here and there, but I was not very familiar with it. It's a mall store that sells games, video games. All right, now shopping malls are as American as apple pie. It's part of our culture here. And at the same time, they're on the downswing. And so you have a shopping mall store that's specializing in selling video games, a lot of which can now be purchased online. And there's a lot of short interest in this stock. All right, there's a lot of speculation that this company is not in good shape. Well, what happened on the Reddit forum is that users became more and more convinced that this stock was being undervalued, the shorts were excessive, and investors started piling in. And what you saw was this huge spike in the stock price, an 1,000% return in less than a week, driven by retail traders who had become extremely excited about this stock due to their interaction on social media. Now, this is obviously one of the most extreme examples, but it highlights the potential importance of this issue. Even if it is only retail investors who are using social media, which might not be the case, but let's say it's largely retail investors, these investors can still have a huge impact on the market. And much of my research focuses on the behavior of individual investors and the impact that has, both on stocks, on firms, on analysts. So that's the broader issue. Now, what about seeking alpha? So there's a few issues here in terms of why we're looking at this. First of all, social media in general is pervasive in society. As I've talked about, it's something that's really important right now. But even more than that, it's increasingly important for financial markets. All right. And seeking alpha is one of those examples of how social media is becoming important for financial markets. It focuses on stock analysis. It focuses on user-generated content. And then the interaction component is an important piece of it. So it is financially focused social media. The other piece I want to highlight here is that social media is essentially an intermediary, right? And I want to step back and think of that in terms of a larger framework. If we think about work on information intermediaries, we have a huge volumes of research on security analysts. I have several of those papers on the press. Even when it comes to the internet, we have a growing body of work. But a lot of this work looks at the internet as essentially a source of information. Similar to reading a newspaper, you now go online and you search for and obtain news. These are all a little bit different from social media. And in particular, I want to highlight a few fundamental differences. And if you're interested in this, we also have in the paper going through these items step by step and talking about how traditional information intermediaries, social media in general, and then seeking alpha in particular compare. Okay, but I just want to highlight a little bit at a high level. What are the differences or the similarities? One of the big pieces that is unique to social media is that interaction that happens. You and me and everyone else able to easily communicate with each other on social media, right? Regardless of whether we are geographically proximate or dispersed. Other things that can be similar or different, the user base. So seeking alpha is largely individual investors, but there are analysts, there are institutional investors, there is a mix in terms of the users. If we think about other types of information intermediaries, that varies, right? So something like Bloomberg terminals are used largely by institutions, Google largely by individuals, right? Security analysts, both. Right? And my work on do security analysts speak in two tongues is looking at that, right? How do they speak to individuals versus institutions? And so you can see how, regardless of the information intermediary you're thinking about, you want to think about the user base. For seeking alpha, it is a mixture, but largely individuals. Other components that are important, the way in which we view other users' posts or comments, right? Which ones do we see and in which order? This is important. We exploit the fact that seeking alpha, you see everything, right? It's not just certain individuals that you follow. It's not just driven by what has been upvoted by others. And so that helps us in terms of identifying, okay, if you are able to see all of this, how does all of this impact you, right? Are the users identified or anonymous? Here on Seeking Alpha, we have a mix, and we are going to exploit that as well. And then content moderation. This has been in the news quite a bit. In the United States, the content moderation differences across certain platforms became very clear during the 2020 election season. And You can listen to podcasts about this. You can read newspaper articles about it. It's fascinating to see how differently different platforms approach this. One point I want to make here is that a lot of times the stated content moderation policy will be very similar across platforms, but the way it's implemented varies. So this one's a hard one to get at, but will be very interesting to examine. In our context, our belief based on what we've been able to gather is that Seeking Alpha is pretty mainstream in terms of content moderation. It's not doing anything extreme. It doesn't eliminate a lot of comments, but if it finds material which is particularly offensive, violates the rules of the forum, it will be deleted. And then finally, whether the forum, the social media, is fully free or has some paid component. Okay. In Seeking Alpha, we do have both. And so we test for robustness of our results based on those components. All right, so this is a larger framework for thinking about it and a little bit of a description of how Seeking Alpha compares. And I definitely want you to think about social media as an important new information intermediary. I think that this is going to have to be a large area of research going forward in finance and accounting. And there are so many unique aspects to social media as compared to traditional financial intermediaries that significant research is needed to truly understand it. Now, what are we going to focus on? We can't tackle all of that in a single paper. We are going to focus largely on the interaction piece, right? And in particular, how does that interaction affect the extremeness of our opinions? Now, I'm going to go into our specific hypotheses here. Just intuitively, I'm sure many of you use social media. How do you think your social media use affects the extremeness of your opinions? Do you tend to see information which is consistent with your viewpoints? If you're on Facebook, and let's say you're fairly liberal, and your friends are fairly liberal, and they're sharing articles which are fairly liberal, that could reinforce your already pre-existing idea and tend to help you get even more liberal. Vice versa, if you're conservative, right? There's an intuitive sense that this might help polarize us. Another effect that social media could have is it could help expose us to differing viewpoints. If you're part of, for example, a diverse and large group on one of these social media forums, and you're starting to see articles which you never would have looked at yourself. Now maybe it helps you to start considering opposing viewpoints. We have three specific hypotheses which are driven by social psychology research. In particular, one possibility is that what we will see on social media is interaction drives belief polarization. We become more and more extreme as we interact with each other on social media. A second possibility is what's called group polarization. And this has been shown in many experiments with face-to-face interaction. What will often happen when you have a group come together is that as the group discusses, as they debate, the entire group does end up agreeing, but they end up with an opinion that's more extreme than any one individual had at the start. So group polarization is a second possibility. And the third is convergence. Our opinions become less extreme as we consider opposing viewpoints, and we converge on something of a middle ground. All right, so these are our three hypotheses, and this is what we ultimately find. We find evidence on Seeking Alpha for convergence. Now, we do a little bit to really get at, well, I shouldn't say a little bit, we do a lot to really get at, is it the interaction that drives this? And our evidence in multiple tests points to the interaction truly driving a convergence, a decrease in extremeness. We also look in additional analyses at some of the factors that might be driving this. In particular, political science research, anecdotes, a lot of what we see online is polarization, is increasing extremeness. So why is Seeking Alpha different? Well, two factors which we believe are potentially important are, one, stocks might not be as inherently controversial as some of the topics that we see online. So we look at this within Seeking Alpha by examining the most controversial versus the less controversial articles. Another piece is that many of the users on Seeking Alpha choose to self-identify. They're not anonymous. And prior research has shown that anonymity is one of the factors that may drive extremeness online. We're more willing to make extreme statements, which then influence others to be even more extreme when we're anonymous. So we examine that as well. Both of these turn out to be important. And then finally, we want to get a sense of whether this impacts the market. And so we relate Seeking Alpha articles with comments to the changes in basically market differences of opinion around those articles. Okay, and I'll get to that later in the talk, but our evidence suggests that there is an association. Bottom line, what do we find? Convergence. Now, the way I'm structuring the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our data and our methods. Some of this is somewhat new and some of it is obviously unique to our study. So I'll go through that. I'll focus on the primary tests and our main results, and then I'll go through these additional analyses that look at the cross-sectional variation and the market impacts. So let's get going. All right, this is a little snapshot of Seeking Alpha comments. What you have on the left is an article, Intel drives autonomously into a glorious future. And then you have some of the comments that appear below this article. Now, if we zoom in on one of these comments, there's three features that we're really going to exploit here. One is that we have a username. And every comment has a username associated with it. The user has to create an account and log in order to comment. And what this allows us to do is track the comments made by an individual user over time, either across articles or for within a single article. Okay, so this is extremely helpful and we're going to utilize this. The second is the text of the comment itself. Now, that text is what we're going to focus on in terms of how extreme is the comment. And then finally, we have a date stamp and a time. And this is very precise, which allows us to order chronologically all of the comments so we can see at the time that Uane53 made their comment, what other comments could this user see? Okay. And so that's the key data that we're using. Overall, it's 10 months of Seeking Alpha comment data. We have over 2,000 firms, and we have an average of 44 comments per article. Okay, so we have a good amount here of interaction. Now, one of the pieces that's extremely important is the text analysis, because ultimately that is how we are going to measure extremeness. And what I want to highlight here is that these comments, they're colloquial English. They're very casual. They're kind of the way we speak to one another. There's sarcasm in there. There's turns of phrase that aren't, that are really culturally associated. And so this is not like something formal. This is not like a 10K. And so it's a different type of language than we've often seen. So when we're looking at this and thinking about how do we measure the extremeness, what we want is something that's good at understanding colloquial English. We do a lot in order to choose what the best method is to do the text analysis for this study. Ultimately, we chose Amazon Comprehend from Amazon Web Services. And this is a deep learning algorithm which does this text analysis. It's trained on Amazon's entire text library, okay? And now that includes things like the reviews which Amazon customers put on products. So you can see how that would be a similar type of colloquial English. And the great thing from a training perspective is that people have put stars to that, right? So we can see, is it extremely negative, a 1 star, let's say, or extremely positive, a 5 star? And Amazon has built that in. The deep learning algorithm has been trained, including that text. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is in a little more detail, is that text analysis and in general, the use of computer science related algorithms in our research is going to be extremely important going forward, right? We're going to analyze text, we're going to analyze images and videos and who knows what. I urge you to think carefully about what features of the algorithm really make sense for your research setting. And in our case, even though there have been some great usages of dictionary-based algorithms in the past, we felt that for this setting, given the style of the comments, the casual nature of the interaction, this Amazon Comprehend would do a better job capturing what we were trying to get at. We also did multiple methods of evaluating and validating that this was appropriate for our setting. And ultimately, we felt it was by far the best method we could use. All right, so that's what we use. If you are looking at understanding social media discussions, I do urge you to take a look at the Amazon Comprehend tool. It is extremely powerful. All right, so now that's our data. Let me get into the actual measures that we use. There's 3 specific extremeness measures that we're going to look at. And I want to talk about these a little bit so that you can understand why we look at all 3. They are conceptually a little bit different. And the 2 most important, I think, to differentiate are absolute extremeness and relative extremeness. So absolute extremeness is what you probably think of is just the absolute value of net sentiment. It's positive minus negative. So if an article is extremely positive, okay, let's say it's very high, the absolute value of that is very high. If it's extremely negative, it's a big negative number, the absolute value of that is very high. So if extremely positive and extremely negative will have high extreme absolute extremeness. Now that captures that overall move away from the middle or towards the middle. But what it would not capture is group polarization, right? Where we're moving towards each other, but we're all going to the side together. Relative extremeness captures that concept. And so for relative extremeness, what we're looking at is how the net sentiment of the given comment compares to everything that came before. So if you become closer and closer to what has been coming before, even if that overall extremeness, the absolute extremeness is increasing, we'll see the relative extremeness decrease, okay? And so that will capture that group polarization idea. And then finally, we look at strong language. And this is just more of a, how do people talk, right? So the absolute and relative extremeness capture our position. Strong language captures how we're expressing it. Now, I'm going to go through this one fairly quickly, but it outlines how our hypotheses relate to these 3 measures. For belief polarization, becoming more extreme away from each other, we'd expect a positive coefficient on all 3 of these. For group polarization, we expect the absolute extremeness to increase and the use of strong language to increase as we become more extreme as a group, but our relative extremeness will decrease because we are now together in this extreme position. And then finally, convergence or depolarization, we would expect negative coefficients on all 3. All right. That's the data and that's the methods, the hypotheses, and what we are looking at. Let me get into the primary tests and the results. So our primary design here is that we're going to use our extremeness measure as the dependent variable, and we're looking at how that relates to where the comment is in the sequence of comments. The later a comment is, the more interaction has already occurred. Okay, so in particular, what we're looking at is the coefficient on that sequence measure, on that interaction measure, positive or negative? Okay, we're going to look at interaction in article comments within article. So we're including here article fixed effects. That's going to control for any of the stock time specific factors that might affect extremeness. Right? So maybe this article was written at a time when this stock is very controversial. We're controlling for that. By including that article fixed effect, what we're looking at is how does the extremeness change over the comment stream for that given article. Maybe everyone's going to be fairly extreme because of the timing, but does that extremeness increase or decrease as the comments continue? Okay, so the fixed effect structure here is very important. Now, as an additional analysis, I should mention we also use user fixed effects here. And so if a person tends to comment later or tends to comment earlier, we're controlling for that, for their tendency to be extreme or not. But we also want to get even more finely at whether the interaction truly changes a person's extremeness. And so we also look within article, within user. And so what we're including here is article user fixed effects. We're restricting the sample to users who have made multiple comments for a single article, and we look at the evolution of their extremeness over those comments as the interaction continues. And then finally, we look at subthreads. One of the challenges with any social media is even if all of these comments are available, that you can read them, you might not necessarily read them. You might just respond directly to the article, right? You might comment on that. Well, if you're responding to a fellow user's comment directly, creating a subthread, now we know for sure you've read their comment. And so we exploit these subthreads as well. All right, so those are the three main tests. Let me show you the results. This is the main result for within article evolution of extremeness. And what you can see is that those coefficients are all negative. Now, I think better in terms of visuals. So I just want to put up this visual here. If you think about a negative number, right? More negative is going to be stronger convergence. More positive is going to be stronger increase in extremeness, polarization. And these negative coefficients all point towards convergence. So for all three measures of extremeness, strong language, relative extremeness, and absolute extremeness, we see convergence. Okay. And these are all have similar standard deviations. You can compare the magnitudes of the coefficients roughly as well to see the size of the effects. It ends up being one standard deviation change in that sequence is about a 5% reduction, 4%, 5%, depending on which measure you're looking at, in extremeness. Okay. All right, so that's the main result within article. Here we have within user within article, and you can see that those coefficients are all significantly negative again, okay, and similar in economic magnitudes. Now, one thing I just want to highlight here, the sample size is a bit smaller because we are restricting to users who have made multiple comments within the article. So the identification here of the interaction effect is very strong, but it also doesn't include everyone. And that's one of the reasons that I like to do both tests. I think it's important to look at the impact on individuals, even if they're only making one comment. But here we can more clearly identify that it is truly the interaction driving it. And so that's also very helpful. All right. Finally, what about subthreads? Again, with subthreads, you see significant decreases in extremeness. You see convergence. So even if I'm responding directly to you, now you could have imagined I'm going to respond to you because I didn't like your comment and I want to disagree. Well, it turns out as our subthread continues, we're actually going to agree with each other more. Now, those are our primary results. And so I just want to highlight, right, summarize these. What do we find? We see a decrease in extremeness. We see people coming together. Okay. We have 3 different extremist measures, 3 different specifications, and in all 9 of those combinations, we see decreasing extremeness. All right, now I have a little bit more to talk about. The next piece is to get into the additional analyses. So let's look at why, right? Again, I started out this talk with an example, Gamestop, where you saw pretty severe extremeness. So what makes seeking alpha have a dominant result of decreasing extremeness, convergence? We hypothesize, based on, again, the social psychology research and other research looking at internet-related effects, that 2 factors are probably important in seeking alpha. One is the extremeness of the articles themselves. Stock-related analysis articles are probably more moderate than articles about social issues or politics. And the other is that many of the users on Seeking Alpha have self-identified. And so they are going to care about their reputations. They're not going to be as extreme as they would if they're anonymous. We look at those by essentially looking at an interaction term. So if you think about our main specification, where we have a coefficient on the sequence, we're also going to now interact that sequence variable with an indicator for whether an article is more or less extreme and whether more users are identified or not. What I've shown here is the results for one of our article extremeness measures. In particular, we look at whether the article itself has very strong language. If it does, we classify that as an extreme article. And what we look at are the less controversial articles, the less extreme articles, are those driving more moderation, more convergence. You can see on those red bars, that is the effect for less controversial articles, whereas the blue bars are the effect for the more controversial ones. You can see that the convergence, the moderation, is significantly stronger for those less controversial red bars. Now, our second measure, we also look at short articles. So on Seeking Alpha, the author of an article can label that article as being an idea for short selling. We argue that short selling tends to be more controversial than typical articles where they have not labeled it as short selling. And what we examine then is the convergence different for a short versus a non-short article. The blue bars are the ones that are labeled as short selling ideas. The red bars are the ones that are not labeled as such. And you can see again that those less controversial non-short selling articles are driving significantly more convergence. Okay, so both of these measures, 2 alternate ways to classify is the article more or less controversial, suggest that less controversial articles, you do see stronger moderation. And that also aligns with our intuition, I would guess, definitely with mine. I don't know about yours, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts at the end. But it aligns with the intuition that stock-related analysis being less controversial is probably part of the reason we see this moderating effect on Seeking Alpha versus something like in political science. All right. Now, I talked about whether the user is identified or anonymous. What we look at is, as a proportion of the individuals making comments on a given article, how many of them have an informative biography. Now, these are voluntary, right? I, as a user, decide, do I want to put a bio up? But the idea is that if I have put a bio up, I am now going to be less likely to be extreme. And by being more thoughtful and moderate in my commenting, I can help drive others to also become more thoughtful and moderate. right? And so the convergence will be stronger when we have more of these types of individuals participating. The blue has more anonymous users. The red has more self-identified users. And again, what you can see is that you have stronger convergence, stronger moderation when you have more self-identified users. All right. That is the cross-sectional variation in this result. And so we find that both the moderateness or extremeness of the article and whether users are identified or anonymous are important factors in how strong of a convergence we find. Now, the final piece is the potential market impact, right? Now, this one's really hard to get at, and it would require an entire study in itself to truly identify causally whether the seeking alpha commenting is driving moderation in the markets. But what we do is we focus on market differences of opinion, right? And we look at the dynamics of that difference of opinion around a seeking alpha article with comments. Okay. We also use some benchmark events, analyst earnings forecasts, and high news days to see whether it's truly seeking alpha articles with comments that drive any convergence we see in the market, or whether it's just information or news, right? And so one of the key differences between analyst forecasts and high news days versus seeking alpha is the commenting, right? We don't have an entire discussion stream about an analyst forecast. There might be informal discussions among individual groups of people, but there won't be a market-wide one like you can have for seeking alpha articles. So let's take a look at the results. Now, this is how the tests look in the paper. There's a lot of numbers. And so what I'm going to end up showing you is some plots instead, but I just wanted to highlight here what we're doing. We have 4 different columns. The first is seeking alpha articles with comments. Day 0 is the day of the article. The majority of the commenting happens on days 0 and 1. So that's when we would expect to see the majority of the drop in differences of opinion if commenting helps with convergence, right? The second column is seeking alpha articles with comments, removing analyst forecasts and high news count days just for cleaner separation. The third column is benchmark analyst forecast days. Fourth column is benchmark high news count days. Okay, so we look at all of these. We also are for each of these looking at the dynamics from day -1 through day 5. Like I said, day 0, 1 is when we expect to see most of the convergence, but we would expect to see that remain, right? If it just reverts back, then it suggests a more fleeting effect. So that's the key in terms of the timeline. And then this is panel A, which has 1 market difference of opinion measure, but we actually look at a total of 3. All right. So let me show you those results in figure form. These are the 3 plots. Those blue lines are the seeking alpha articles with comments. The red line is analyst forecasts, and the green line is high news count days. And as you can see, we have the 3 different plots for the 3 different market differences of opinion measures. Now, what you can see from all 3 of these is, first of all, there is a spike on day 0 for analyst forecasts and high news count days. So those drive actually increased differences of opinion, which then reverts roughly back to 0. But for the blue lines, for seeking alpha articles with comments, we see differences of opinion drop. By day 1, they are negative. That's significantly lower than basically on days -2 or -1, and they remain low. Okay, the tables have all of the actual coefficients and the asterisks and show you the significance levels. But what you can see if you look at those is that these are largely significant. All right, so we have a lot of consistent results that seeking alpha articles are followed by a decrease in differences of opinion in the market, whereas our benchmark events are not. Okay. Now, one additional test we do, which is not tabulated in the paper, we already have quite a lot in there, but we discuss it, is we subdivided the Seeking Alpha articles with comments into quintiles based on the number of comments. So again, if we think it's the interaction that's driving the decreases in market differences of opinion, we should see a stronger drop in the market differences of opinion when we have active commenting, okay? And this sample includes any number of comments. What we find is that for quintiles 3 through 5, so higher levels of commenting, the top 60%, we have strong and consistent results for a decrease in market differences of opinion. In quintiles 1 and 2, one in particular, the results are less consistent, which is exactly what we would expect if the effect is being driven by comments. So let me summarize. There's a lot in here. Thank you for staying focused on this through all of these results. What do we learn? The main takeaway is that the extremeness of opinions decreases. We get convergence as individuals interact on Seeking Alpha. So social media can, in fact, drive moderation, not just extremeness. Why? Well, we point to two specific factors: the low source article extremeness, the low extremeness of these articles themselves, and having identified users. But remember, the results are robust, even if we look at the most extreme Seeking Alpha articles or the articles where most of the users are anonymous. So in part, this is just a fact of Seeking Alpha interaction, but it is stronger when you have less extreme articles and more identified users. And then finally, we have evidence suggesting that this has a significant impact on the market itself, on stock-related differences of opinion. So online interaction reduces extremeness in this setting. Now, that was slide 1 of 1. Slide 2 of 2. I do want to acknowledge that there are many unanswered questions when it comes to social media. Our goal here is to address one, which we believe is extremely important. How does interaction affect extremeness? But if you think about social media more broadly, how it's used, its impact on financial markets, its impact on us as individuals, as market participants and users, and the social media itself, the number and variation of these different types of forums, the technology, the changes that are coming and that have occurred in terms of regulation, the variation across countries and across cultures in how social media is used. There is a lot of work to be done for us to truly understand this information intermediary. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to reading your questions and answering them and our active discussion about this paper. Thank you again for the invitation. I'll go ahead and stop my slides and let Sakshi take over.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Devin, for such an insightful lecture. We have learned a lot from this lecture today. So if you would like, we can start with the Q&A session.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question we have is from Niramay, and he wants to know, could this also work the other way, making it easier to control people's belief and opinions?
That's an interesting question. So obviously our research can't speak to that specifically, right? But I can speculate based on what we're looking at. If you think about the increased tendency to converge, if an article writer wants to drive investors to agree with them, a forum like this where you get increased convergence would be better for that article writer, right? If you have a different forum where people tend to be extremely, I'm not sure quite the word, but let's just say argumentative. They tend to disagree with authors. They tend to polarize very quickly. That author might have less influence if they posted their article on that forum. And so that's an interesting point, Nirame, that in a sense, if you do want to influence people's beliefs and opinions, And I'll use the word influence instead of control. Hopefully we're not, little puppets, but if you want to influence them, a forum like this might be better. But one point I want to make is that what we find is that convergence to other users, not necessarily a convergence to what the article author is writing. So if the article author was trying to make a really extreme statement, they might actually not be able to pull Seeking Alpha users that far, right? So it depends a little, but if you're trying to influence people's beliefs and opinions within a moderate range, yeah, that's quite possible.
Yes, Professor Chitrakalpa.
Thank you very much, Devin. That was an amazing presentation. I have one question though, and it's more about the external validity, and it's not only about the Seeking Alpha forum. Some other forums we have seen, for example, let's say Twitter, we see a lot of discussion and they can get really polarized at times. But one you have, one thing that you have mentioned at one point of your lecture is that the social media is a curated ecosystem, right? So we follow the people we like, we comment on we retweet and we like the comments that you really like. So this subsequent reinforcing behavior, all right, so it can lead to some sort of a hard effect, right? So it can create unexpected market shocks, like we have seen in case of the GameStop short squeeze. Do you think that if unregulated, this has a potential to lead to or the creation of an asset bubble, which can wreak havoc on the market, or do you think it's too tiny a phenomenon to create an asset bubble?
So, I mean, a lot of my work has looked at the effect of individual investors. And even before the internet, when we had just retail investors trading in Charles Schwab accounts, right? We didn't have as active, as low cost of retail investor direct access to the market as we do now. Even then, I find significant impacts of retail investor behavior, of sort of biases, psychological biases on the market. And so if you think about in the current environment, when we have even more active, faster, lower cost trading, and a lot of the more sophisticated investors are using algorithmic trading, which can end up triggering reinforcing moves in the market, it seems like we have to pay attention to the potential impacts that retail investors will have, right? Absolutely, it can cause bubbles, it can cause crashes. Now, would those eventually correct? On average, will prices be right? That's almost a philosophical question, right? Rather than something we can speak to with evidence. But definitely, I would say the evidence itself says the swings are going to happen. And so we should be paying attention to that, okay? Now, the specific point that you made about Twitter, for example, retweets, liking, that's one of the differences between Seeking Alpha and Twitter, is that on Seeking Alpha, you're going to see all of the comments. It's not just the ones that have been retweeted or the ones that people have liked, right? Reddit has a very strong mechanism in place for upvotes. So what people are liking becomes basically the top. Twitter and Facebook, it's what people retweet or share, and it's your friend network or who you're following that you tend to see. And so I do think it's important. One of the reasons that this is, I think, interesting research is it suggests that if you see everything, the impact on your extremeness, that might be different, right? And so if we think about something like Twitter or Facebook, maybe we should, now obviously the algorithms are designed to have us see what we want to see to keep us on the forum. But if the algorithms have us see some things that maybe we wouldn't normally look for, they have us see a larger sample of diverse opinions, the effects could be very different. So I think there's a lot more work that has to be done to fully understand these dynamics. But absolutely, I think retail investors are important and can significantly impact the market to the extent of bubbles and crashes. And we need to understand how these different types of social media impact these investors.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for answering the question.
Yeah.
So we have two more questions, both from Ayushman. So the first question is, how does the author of the article come to play in the study? For example, an influential writer expressing his or her own views. And the second question is, what is Seeking Alpha's moderation policy?
These are great questions, Ayushman. So let me talk about the first one first, and then we'll get to the second. In terms of the author, all of the articles that we examine are the author expressing their own views or analysis. So we exclude articles which are essentially just regurgitating or summarizing news. Okay, and so we're focusing on what are called analysis articles on Seeking Alpha. And again, that's because we don't want to just focus on, are people reading the news and reacting? That's sort of what we understand from work on media or on search. What we want to understand is, how do people react when they're reading and now interacting? They're reading a new opinion and interacting around that, right? Now, in terms of the variation across these authors, we have not really exploited that. What we've done so far is more of robustness tests. So we've seen, for example, if the author is active in the comments themselves or not active, does that have an impact? We've looked at authors who author a lot versus authors who don't, who write just a few articles. And the results are largely robust. But that said, we haven't really dug into the cross-sectional variation with respect to that. Are there differences in how strong the result is? The result's there, regardless, but we haven't fully exploited that. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that. Do you have any hypotheses coming into it in terms of whether an author who's more influential, whether they would lead to stronger conversions? Or we sort of intuitively thought that, but we wanted to stick with cross-sectional variation hypotheses where we had strong theory motivating them. And on this one, we weren't sure that we had strong enough theory to examine it. So I guess the bottom line is, it's robust to variation in author. We have not fully exploited that. And if you have more ideas about it, I would love to hear those. Okay. Now, in terms of the content, the moderation policy, the moderation policy is largely that they will take down comments that have inappropriate language, that are advertisements, that are just completely not discussion, or that are not constructive discussion, right? So if there's just incendiary comments, they'll take that out. Now, that's the official policy. It's very similar to what we see in other official policies in other forms, and we've done a lot of comparing. The problem is we don't actually see the moderation. We don't see what was there that was then taken off. And so, we've had conversations, we've tried to look at this sort of anecdotally, and there's definitely plenty of controversial comments that remain on the forum. So they're not just taking off anything that's extreme. Another feature that we looked for is user commenting about the moderation. So what we found is that on certain forums, like Twitter, for example, where their moderation can be very strong, people get upset about that and they comment about the moderation itself. We don't really see that on Seeking Alpha, which suggests that people are not upset about extreme moderation, right? So we're using all of these indirect methods to get a sense, and it seems like Seeking Alpha is doing fairly standard moderation where they're removing things that are completely off the wall, but they're not doing anything very strong where they're removing even things that are just controversial. Okay, but like I said, I would love even more. I would love if I could actually see what comments they do remove. We have not been able to get that data.
Okay, so I guess these are the only questions we had for the day. Any other question? If yes, I'd request you to please raise your hand.
I think there's another one by Ayushman.
Okay, yes, there is one more question. Uh, Also, just a follow-up question from Ayushman's side. Do you
Mhm.
foresee the SEC coming up with regulations on content on social media regarding financial assets? Are there any discussions or studies about this?
Um, it is happening now. The discussions are starting now. There aren't studies yet. I think there will be, and I hope that ours will be one of the ones that's part of that. Quite frankly, the GameStop situation, because it was so high profile, so extreme, it brought a lot of attention to this topic. There are going to be congressional hearings in the United States about what happened with GameStop. A lot of the important players are going to be testifying to Congress. And then Congress will have to decide if and how they want to regulate this. The SEC typically then enacts the regulations by developing the detailed policies and enforcing those. Okay, so that's the overall process. And we're essentially at the very early stages of that, the investigatory phase. And so I think it's quite possible that there will be regulations, but right now no one knows. And absolutely the US government is looking at it. So it's going to be very interesting to see. I think that we need more research in this area to help inform that policy. Otherwise, this policy is going to be set by people who don't really understand what's going on in the market, right? So that's one piece. The other piece that I think will be really interesting to see is how these regulations will vary from country to country. Because it's social media, right? It's online. In that sense, we should be able to all interact, and yet you could have different countries having different regulations for what's allowed. And so it's going to be very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess these are the only questions we have. Let me just check the chat box as well.
Mhm.
Yes, that's about it. So thank
Okay.
you so much, Dr. Devin, for joining us today. Thank you
Thank you.
everyone else as well for joining us today. Before we close today's talk, I would like to invite you all to our next CRE lecture, which will be held on the 14th of April by Professor Kate Philaktis, Cass Business School, City University of London. Thank you again, everyone, for joining in today.
Thank you. And I just want to say, if you have additional comments or questions for me, feel free to reach out to me directly, right? If you think of something after this talk that you'd like to discuss. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dr.